For centuries, he's been called the greatest writer in the English language. But what if the man we know as William Shakespeare never actually wrote a single word? Today, we're not just reading Shakespeare, we're going to put him under the microscope.
And it's almost like the author himself gave us our mission statement. Time's glory is to unmask falsehood and bring truth to light. And that's exactly what we're going to try to do. Just follow the evidence wherever it takes us.
I mean, everybody knows the name, right? Shakespeare is this absolute giant of literature. But behind that legend, there's this huge question that has puzzled some of history's greatest minds. Was the man from Stratford really the author?
And look, this is not some newfangled internet conspiracy theory. The list of people who have seriously questioned the official story is pretty staggering. I mean, we're talking about heavy hitters like Mark Twain and Sigmund Freud, and brilliant artists like Charlie Chaplin and Orson Welles. These aren't casual skeptics. These are giants of history who looked at the story and saw a genuine mystery.
All right, so before we can really dig into the doubt, we've got to understand the official story first, right? Let's start with what you might call the prosecution's case. The standard, long-held belief that the man from Stratford-upon-Avon was in fact the author.
So, the whole traditional case basically stands on these four big pillars of evidence. His name was on the published works, a famous collection of his plays called the First Folio points right to him, fellow actors said he was the guy, and there's a monument to him in his hometown. And at first glance, yeah, it seems pretty open and shut. But, and this is a big but, that's where things start to get really interesting.
So now, it's time for the cross-examination. Because the moment you start to really push on those four pillars, you realize they're not nearly as solid as you think. In fact, every single one has some pretty serious cracks.
Okay, let's just start with the name itself. On all the published works, the author's name was Shakespeare. Sometimes it was even hyphenated, like Shakespeare, which, by the way, it was super rare for an English name back then. But in every single official record we have of the man from Stratford, his name was spelled differently, Shakespeare or Shakespeare. And get this, it was never hyphenated. It feels like a small detail, but it could be a massive clue.
And then there's this massive timing problem. The First Folio, that's the first big collection of his plays and probably the most important document linking the man to the works, well, it wasn't published until 1623. That's a full 7 years after the man from Stratford had already died. I mean, think about it. Why would the biggest piece of evidence proving he's this literary genius only show up so long after he's gone?
And that really leads to this question that just hangs over this whole debate. When the supposed literary giant of the age died in 1616, there was crickets, nothing. No public mourning, no letters from fellow writers, no heartfelt eulogies, and then 7 years later, bam, this huge, lavish tribute book appears out of nowhere. So why the 7 years of complete silence?
Even the hard physical evidence is kind of sketchy. See, there's this early sketch of the original monument from 1634, and it shows a guy who looks, for all the world, like a merchant, holding a big sack of grain or wool. No pen, no paper. But the monument that's there today, it's been changed. Now it shows a poet holding a quill. And we know from historical records that the monument was officially repaired. But it looks a lot less like a repair and more like a total rebranding to fit a new story.
All right, now let's get to what a lot of people think is the real smoking gun in this whole thing. The complete, total, and baffling lack of any literary paper trail left behind by the man from Stratford.
This right here might be the single most shocking part of this entire mystery. So how many original manuscripts, plays, poems, anything, do we have in his own handwriting? 0. What about letters he wrote to anyone about anything? 0. Books we know for a fact that he owned? You guessed it, 0. For the most celebrated writer in the entire English language, there is literally a black hole where his literary life should be.
And his will? Oh, that just makes things even weirder. It's a really detailed document, and it inventories the life of a pretty successful local businessman. He leaves behind property, business interests, silver bowls, and yeah, famously, his second best bed to his wife. But there is not one single mention of any books, manuscripts, poems, or any hint whatsoever of a literary legacy. This is the will of a businessman, someone who dealt in things, not ideas.
So all this missing evidence, it all points to an even bigger problem, really. The documented life of the man from Stratford just seems completely and totally at odds with the kind of mind that created these incredible works of art. Okay, so this slide really just lays it all out, the huge mismatch here. On one hand, you have the author of the plays. This person had a deep, intimate knowledge of court life, of the law, of foreign countries like Italy and France.
He knew about aristocratic sports, music, philosophy. On the other hand, you have the documented record of the man from Stratford. He was a businessman, a minor actor, even a tax delinquent. He has no record of ever leaving England, and he grew up in an illiterate household. So you have to ask yourself, how does that guy become this guy?
And the more you dig into his life, the stranger it gets. I mean, his own parents and even one of his daughters, they were illiterate. They signed documents with a mark. There's no record he ever went to a university or even a grammar school. And while the author was writing these sublime plays about kings and queens, the historical record showed the Stratford man was being investigated for hoarding grain during a famine and suing his neighbors over tiny debts. And then, at the absolute peak of his supposed genius, he just stops. He retires to his small town in his late 40s and apparently never writes another word. Does that really sound like the world's greatest writer?
And look, don't just take my word for it or the word of the doubters. This is a quote from Sam Schoenbaum, and he's not some fringe theorist. He's one of the most respected, mainstream Shakespeare biographers out there. And even he admitted that there's a vertiginous expanse, basically a dizzying, unbridgeable chasm between the absolute sublimity of the works and the totally mundane, documented life of the man.
So, okay, after looking at all this evidence, the weird timing, the missing paper trail, the life that doesn't seem to fit, where do we land? Well, the verdict here isn't necessarily about crowning some new author. It's about something much simpler, a standard you'd find in any courtroom.
And this is the really crucial takeaway here. The argument isn't to definitively prove that some other person, like Francis Bacon or the Earl of Oxford, was the true author. The goal is much simpler. It's to show that based on everything we've seen, there is absolutely reasonable doubt about the official story. And if there's reasonable doubt, then the question itself deserves to be taken seriously.
It's like the famous Oxford historian Hugh Trevor Roper said, the fact that the greatest of all Englishmen, after this tremendous inquisition, still remains so close to a mystery that even his identity can still be doubted, is, in itself, one of the most mind-boggling puzzles in history.
So we'll leave you with this final thought. The point of all this wasn't to solve the mystery, but maybe just to prove that a profound mystery really does exist. And that forces us to ask a much bigger question. Because if we can't even be sure about the identity of the greatest writer in history, what else? What other big truths from the past do we only think we know?